it's actually a standard textbook for computer ethics. It's used in many universities for computer ethics. The main chapter that is relevant right now is Introduction to Ethics, right? Where it talks about ethical theories. So by the way, one more fantastic book that if you get a chance you should read is a book by Michael Sandel called Justice, What is the Right Thing to Do? Right? Sandel's book is also very, very accessible. It talks about all of these ethical theories that we're going to see and gives lots of examples, right? So it's really a good book for the general reader, in fact. And one more book that I recommended that you should all read is by Norbert Wiener called The Human Value of Human Beings. So Norbert Wiener is considered as the father of computer ethics, and he was a mathematician and he worked a lot in during the World Wars for automated control of missile systems. The book is excellent. It talks about feedback loops of technology, it talks about informatization, challenges with that, it talks about how informatization is exploited by the market system to entrench existing capitalist social systems even further. So it basically touches upon everything, and it's a fantastic book. So here we go through it relatively quickly, right? That ultimately now we're saying that we live in a society, right? And therefore there needs to be certain rules, certain systems with which we need to live by, right? And we will also try to be better in the terminology that we use. So normally when we say something is unethical, actually in most cases what we mean is that it is immoral, right? So morality is, it comes from that what are these rules that we should live by, right? But ethics is about the reasoning, why these rules come into the picture, right? So ethics, theories about ethics teach us about reasoning, and all of these were born out of the enlightenment. So you might, when you start going into social sciences literature, you'll see this phrase coming up quite a bit, the enlightenment era, which basically came around the 18th century, and it's all about moral reasoning, that okay, something seems to be bad, but why is it bad? Yeah. And that is the main rationality that we would like to examine, that through what theories, through what frameworks should we think to figure out whether something is moral or not, right? So how do we derive these rules in the first place? Yeah, go
I
on.
have a question. So
Yeah.
if everyone follows the same rule, for
Yeah.
example, the culture biases or cultural differences, so
Hmm.
would that be also called a bad ethics or something like that? Maybe in one
Yeah.
country some rules are not according to the people, but in other country they may be culture bias.
Correct, correct. So we'll exactly get into that, Amit, now. So this is
Mhm.
something called cultural relativism, which we'll just see. So the point is that embracing that there are different rules instead of one moral view, that is perfectly fine, right? In fact, that's also what many people like Arturo Escobar and others talk about, right? That, and fundamentally it's also linked to freedom, right? Ultimately, libertarianism says that as an individual I should be able to figure out what I want to do, right? Or if you look at it more from a sovereignty point of view, then well, countries or regions should be able to figure out what they want to do, right? So in some sense that plurality is embraced, but the point is that how did any of these cultures or societies come up with those rules in the first place, right? That's still where we need reasoning, right? That we can't say that, well, I just chose this rule because I think I like it, or so we'll just look at these criticisms over here. So these are what are called normative ethical theories that we're going to see, right? The word normative over here means that it starts with putting down some axioms. So it's not questioning where these axioms are coming from, but once these axioms are in place, then what rules come up through these axioms, right? So they essentially, and as we'll see, none of these theories is perfect. And in the real world, we see many versions of these theories sort of being applied and used by people at different times, right? But what they tell us is they give us a lens with which to look at the world, right? With which to think about what factors we should consider in our decision making. So this lens is very important because each one of them comes from, essentially gives us a different lens to look at, right? So one is exactly what you were saying, right? Relativism, right? That there are no universal norms. Each person sort of decides for himself what is right, and what's right for you may not be right for me. So yeah, I mean this is also what happens a lot in practice, right? But the point is that it's not really giving a reason, right, as to why I am saying this is right or this is wrong, right? So there needs to be something deeper than just saying that I'm right and you're wrong, right? There needs to be a deeper reasoning, right? So like how Quinn lays it out, he says that well, there's not a workable ethical theory because it's not really giving us any framework to reason. Then cultural relativism, which is exactly what you were talking about, right? What is right or wrong depends upon a society's moral guidelines, and these may vary, right? So this is how it is. We know that well, there are different contexts and so on. So there should be different. There can be different moral guidelines, right? But the point is that it doesn't explain how these guidelines are determined, right? So again, there needs to be something deeper over here. That even though you have different cultures, why did this culture adopt some particular guidelines for itself, right? So that is where so again it basically says that we can't operate at that level. We need to go one level deeper, right? That where did these in fact come from? And potentially once you do that, then maybe we might also see some universal norms as emerging. Yeah. And yeah, I mean, certain universal norms do exist, as we know, right? It's pretty much not acceptable in any society to just kill somebody for no reason, right? So there are certain things which are universally acceptable, but ultimately it boils down to reasoning for each of these, right? Then there is a divine control theory that God said that this is right, and therefore this is what we'll do, right? So this again, well, there are religious points over here. Ultimately, right, the whole argument over there is that we don't know exactly how everything came about. Our knowledge is limited, so there is some divine intervention, and we just need to think from that point of view, right? But again, the point again is that there's it's based on obedience. There's no reason coming in over here, right? So again, this is not helping us think through the reasons behind why these laws or rules came up in the first place. Yeah. Then there's something called ethical egoism, that each person just focuses on their own self-interest, right? And the assumption is that if everybody just focuses on the self-interest, then some broader long-term benefit will emerge to everybody. So there's a sort of like in common parlance you hear about this invisible hand of the market, right? That if everybody works in their self-interest, then the market will lead to a situation where everybody comes out as better off, right? So it's practical, it's usable. Everybody is sort of thinking that there is a particular reasoning attached behind it, in the sense that each individual determines their own self-interest. So it's not that, unlike some of the earlier ones, where we did not delve deeper into the reason. Here, you're saying that well, there's some rationality, right? People are rational beings, and they will figure out what's right for them in their self-interest. But here, the point is that self-interest can lead to immoral behavior, as we know, right? You might do things in a very greedy manner, and people will not accept that. Yeah, even in economics, with the invisible hand, we know that it's not the perfect solution, right? Because we've seen time and again, markets are imperfect. So even though you might have people, well, first of all, rationality itself, right? So this is where theories like bounded rationality came in. That well, it is very difficult for people to be rational beings, which is what economics assumes, because you might just have too much of variables that you need to deal with and reason through, right? So that's one reason why just assuming that people are rational beings doesn't work. But even if you do assume that, we know that markets can be very unequal. So this is why market regulations are brought into the picture, so that there's to ensure that there's competition. There's not one monopoly player which is who can control all of this, right? So again, right, this again is not really workable in that sense, that it's easy to implement properly, but it's still not giving us some kind of a basis to think about rules for living together in a society. So this is really where the whole meat of normative theories starts from, right? So Immanuel Kant was a very prominent philosopher in the 18th century, and sort of one of the forebearers of this whole Enlightenment movement, right? People started thinking more from that, okay, there needs to be a reason behind everything. There needs to be some rationality behind everything. So here's what axiom with which Immanuel Kant started out, right? That people need to have a goodwill, right? Once people have goodwill, it will persuade them to be dutiful and follow certain rules. Dutiful people will feel compelled to act in a certain way, And eventually, if everybody has this goodwill, it will lead to their actions being grounded in moral rules, right? So the point that he said, that how do we inculcate a goodwill in people, yeah. And he came up with this formulation, right? It is called Kant's categorical imperative, yeah. And it has many, right? So as we go along, right, so we'll discuss, right? It has very wide ramifications, right? Act only from moral rules that you can at the same time will that there should be universal moral laws, right? So do not act from a rule which you wouldn't want others to follow. Yeah. Only adopt a rule only if you think that if this were a universal rule, even then it will, right? That would be a desirable situation. Yeah. So here you can see many things operating, right? So one is this whole notion of taking other people into account, right? And from a universal standpoint, yeah, that should I create this particular policy which might benefit only some people? Yeah. So now when you think about it, right, that if everybody were to think in that way, right, would that still materialize, right? Would you still want something like that to be in the picture, right? So one of the examples that they give is about promises, right? So if somebody needs help, right, and they say that, well, if you help me, I promise that I will return your money, right? If you right, I need to borrow money. If you promise to help me, I will make sure I will return the money. Let's say even with interest or whatever, right? But your intention over here was to eventually break the promise, right? But now if you apply Kant's rule over here, that should you do this, right? Should you promise for something with the intention of breaking your promise later, right? And if you universalize it, right? So there, then you have a situation where people will start making promises which they do not intend to keep. Yeah. And in this kind of a scenario, promise making itself will just completely lose its value, right? So nobody would want to make promises, nobody would want to believe in promises, because everybody is operating from a standpoint that if we make promises, we might just break them later. Yeah. And therefore you will say that I reject this rule, right? Therefore I will not bring in, I will only make promises only that I intend to keep. I will not make promises that I don't intend to keep. Yeah. So you can see how this particular reasoning is helping you figure out what action you should take, right? Should I make a promise with the intention of breaking it, or should I not make a promise because I don't know if I can keep it up? Yeah. So there is this notion of universality, therefore, that comes in, right? Another way in which he stated this was that act so that you treat both yourself and other people as ends in themselves and never as a means to an end, right? So here, basically, you're saying that don't use people as an instrument to achieve your own goals, right? Right. And this is essentially talking about respecting others, right? Respecting the rationality of others, right? So which also comes across from the first formulation, yeah, that ultimately you are putting in a lens of looking at the rest of the world. You're respecting other people, you're respecting their rationality, you're respecting their presence. You will not use them as a means to an end or as an instrument to achieve your own goals. You will not try to fool them. You will respect their rationality, that they are also thinking people. They will also have their own thoughts, their own reasons, and you should respect that, right? Yeah. So now if you think about it, right? I mean, this sort of a principle of respecting others, going from taking this universal view, this is also ultimately also some of the values that democracy espouses, right? Where each person has a vote, there is universal suffrage. You need to consider everybody's opinions to arrive at a, right. You might want to arrive at a consensus. You might want to make compromises because, right, it might not be the best thing for you, but it's helping somebody else, right? Kant's formulation, therefore, right, it's not perfect. So we look at some exceptions, right? But it, at least the lens that it is providing is that of universality, right? To think about other people before you make a rule or before you take some action. Yeah. So there are these other scenarios, right? That so there's a working person who's taking classes and they have to write a report. but Carla purchases a report and submits it as her own work, right? So according to the first formulation of that, you adopt a rule only if everybody else will also be willing to adopt the same rule, right? That the rule is that you may claim credit for work performed by someone else, right? If the rule is universalized, then reports will no longer have any value. Yeah. And it would just be self-defeating, right? So it is so this would reject that something like this is done, right? From the second formulation, where you treat others as a means to an end, right? That here she was attempting to undermine the rationality of the professor, right? Right. So therefore, what this particular action is not moral according to if you're operating from Kant's philosophy. Yeah. And it tells you that, well, you understand that others are rational as well. Are you creating an information asymmetry, which means that you know more than some other person, and therefore you are taking that action, right? So you need to think about, well, if everybody knew about this, would they still take the same action? Right? Decide your action so that it does not disrespect the rationality of others. Yeah. So now the good thing over here is that it's giving you a rule, right? It's giving you a rule to reason, which can lead to moral guidelines. So right, this is what ethics wants to, a reasoning framework that ethical theories want to put into place. Yeah. And then there are details like Kant talks about perfect duties, which should never be, which should always be performed, never violated. Imperfect duties, which should sometimes be performed, right? And so there are some very interesting examples in Sandel's book. Right? So one example I remember is, so there's a murderer who's chasing somebody, right? And that person comes to your home and asks for protection, right? And then when the murderer comes knocking on the door, then the murderer says, "Did this person come here?" Right? So if you're just operating through Kant's theory, yeah, and right, so in some sense you also need to respect the rationality of the murderer, right? Maybe that person has a particular reason, right? If you were in that person's position, would you want to be lied to, right? So here we see that it's not perfect. There are all these called what are commonly known as ethical dilemmas, which arise if you're just operating from one of these theories. That in this case you wouldn't want to lie, right? Because you're essentially respecting the ration, right? The rule says respect everybody's rationality, so you're also respecting the rationality of the murderer, right? So there are all these dilemmas which can arise if you're just following one single theory, right? But the point is that it's giving you a very valuable lens. It's giving you a very valuable a way to look at the rest of the world, right? That other people, you need to respect other people, their rationality. Don't You shouldn't treat them as means to an end, right? More relaxed versions of this would say that you follow those principles, but you can possibly compromise in certain situations, right? Right. So that's the idea. Right, so Kantianism leads to all of these conflicts, right? Conflicts between duties in some weird situations, but still the point is that it's giving you a particular framework for reasoning. Yeah. So any theory is called utilitarianism, which comes from Jeremy Bentham. So Bentham was another very wide-ranging philosopher, and in fact, now this utility theory is everywhere, right? Utility theory is the basis of economics. Utility theory is also, in many ways, it is the basis of machine learning, where you have a loss function at the end of the day that you're trying to minimize, right? And this loss function has all these different variables in it which you're trying to minimize. Right now, some of these variables may even be conflicting, but you've assigned certain weights to them, and you're trying to minimize that. Right. So the way this theory essentially works, so the utility theory, maybe many of you already know about it, right? So it basically says that the welfare, right? You work towards maximizing group welfare, and group welfare is basically the sum of the welfare of all individuals in the group, right? So basically summation of yi's, where the yi is an individual's welfare. So you decide to do something if overall the sum of the utility is improving, right? Maybe if you help one person more than the other, it's possible that the sum of the utility that emerges from this is higher, right? And therefore you will choose that particular situation. basically it says that, well, how do you evaluate this cost and benefit? So it uses things like happiness, advantage, benefit, pleasure, and so on as good things, unhappiness, disadvantage, pain as negatives. Okay. Right. So that's the main idea. Jeremy Bentham came up with this formulation. Why there are many issues that we talk about, right? But again, the fundamental lens that this is giving us is a notion of overall social welfare. That that sometimes you want to think from what is good for the overall society, right? Maybe things could be unjust to one person or somebody, right? But overall, what is the great, in some sense, what is the greater good, right? And therefore, you might be willing to make certain compromises with certain individuals with the idea that it will maximize the greater good, right? So one way in which you would see this coming out as some ethical dilemmas where these theories are used for discussion. That you're what's known as a trolley problem. That you're driving a trolley on a railroad and it is bifurcating and your brakes are not working, and on one side there is a family of with three children who are crossing the track, and on the other side there's a fat person who's crossing the track. So what would you do, right? And it comes up in many ways, right? In fact, even in the COVID situation, right? I don't know if any of you personally went through such things, but right, there's a whole triaging protocol that if, especially if there is a lack of resources in the hospital to treat everybody, then who should be given priority, right? Should a younger person be given priority or an older person? And the sort of thinking over here that comes in is that the younger person has a longer life in front of him. They'll play a bigger role in society. The older person is sort of has already done whatever economic welfare they could lead to, right? So therefore one is better than the other, right? Now you can think of so many issues with this, right? So many issues, right? That how do you measure social welfare, right? Is it only based on the economic output that a person is capable of producing, right? Which is why you would favor somebody younger versus somebody older, right? Or is it about favoring children over older people or obese people, right? Are there some stereotypes coming into the picture, right? So there's many complexities, and ultimately, right, this is also not a perfect theory, right? But the crucial lens that it is giving us to examine is one, that of examining consequences, right? That if we do this, what is the overall consequence? Second, it's bringing in a notion of overall group welfare, of social overall social welfare over here. And third, it's telling us that you need to figure out who are you including in your equation, right? What are these yi's that are being included, right? And therefore, it persuades us to think about broader stakeholders. So just like Kant was talking of universalizing, right? That you think about everybody. Similarly, over here, you need to think about many stakeholders, right? Many people who could benefit or who could be harmed from a decision. Then you're really taking consequentialist approach, that you're thinking about what will be the outcome, and you're basing your decision based on that outcome. And then there is a general theory of looking at social welfare or the greater good. Yeah. Right. So an action is right or wrong to the extent that it increases or decreases the total happiness of the affected parties. Yeah. Right. So it says that, well, nothing to do with intent. It focuses on the consequences. It's a consequentialist theory. Add up the change in happiness of all affected beings. If the sum is more than zero, action is good. Less than zero, action is bad. So there are these examples which are shown that the state may replace a stretch of road on the highway by building a new bridge, but that requires certain houses to be removed, and some wildlife would also be destroyed, right? And it costs whatever, right? So now you can start attaching some cost to it, right? Then how do you measure social welfare? So let's do it in monetary terms. That okay, 20 million to compensate the homeowners, 10 million to construct the new highway. Loss of wildlife habitat you've estimated in some way as 1 million, right? So this tells you, for example, why it is very hard to use this in practice, because how do you assess wildlife habitat over here? Same, right? In terms of when we're talking about this hospital situation, right? So if you're basing your decision on economics, then how are you estimating the value of life, right? That then you're saying that the value of life of a younger person is more than the value of life of an older person. How do you attach a monetary value to this situation? Yeah. Same as the issue that how do you actually assign value to wildlife? So by the way, just a digression, right? So value of life. So it's very interesting, right? Right? You do hear about value of life in many places, right? Something like $9 million value of a human life. In the US, that sort of number which is used, especially with making insurance claims and stuff. Similarly, in India, there would be something now. The way these are estimated is in a right very statistical manner, something called actuarial accounting, where essentially what they do is they look at the work profile and how much are you earning for this work versus what is the risk to life while doing that work. So the idea is that you will earn more if there is a higher risk to life. You will earn less if there is for a similar kind of work if you're working in a way where there is less risk to life. So they use that to build a relationship between risk to life and then how much are you paid for each of these, right? You paid more for working in a setup where there is a higher risk to life, you paid less, right? And these prices are what the market has determined, what the labor market has ultimately determined, what you end up getting paid for these different pieces of work. So, right, so that is used to draw up a relationship and between risk to life and the price that the economy is attaching to that risk, right? But anyway, coming back, right? So the point is that you can then say that, well, what are the benefits? So you calculate the benefits in this case, that it reduces automobile driving costs, right? You look at depreciation of the car, you look at fuel savings, maybe you also look at environmental impact, right? So maybe you take environmental impact also into account that now people are driving less, and then you use that to come up with a decision. Yeah, right. So again, the point is that you can build a reasoning, right? So that is why this theory, right, it is a workable theory in the sense that there is a particular framework that is given to you to think about. But of course there are many problems, like we've seen, right? Unclear whom to include in the calculations, too much work, it ignores any sense of justice or any sense of duty, I mean individual justice in some sense. Also susceptible to the problem moral luck. So moral luck in the sense that if you did something wrong, but ultimately it did not harm anybody. So let's say you drove through a traffic light, you drove through a red light, and you were able to make it through, no damage happened, right? Then you're saying, well, I was better off, right? I saved some time and it didn't harm anybody else, and therefore this is good, right? We can go, right? So I did the right thing. So this is called moral luck. That you're in hindsight, you're saying that this decision was good because you just got lucky, that nothing bad happened. Yeah, right. So these are some issues against utilitarianism, right? But again, like I said, the what it's the lens which it is giving us is to consider different stakeholders in some formal manner. So you're explicitly saying that I've included these people and not included these other people in my reasoning, right? So it's trying to make that explicit. Then there's a notion of greater good which can be favored over individual costs and benefits, individual problems that people might face. So, like homeowners in this case would have to move somewhere, right? So they're being compensated, but we all know, right, that it disrupts community life. It leads to so many other issues, right? So we've seen these same arguments happening in like slum resettlement, right? Where entire bastis, in fact, there's a big issue going on around Faridabad these days of people who are being moved much further out to the city. Now they're saying that, well, we have a community life, we've invested in building these homes and everything, so it's going to be, right? There'll be more time that we need, more transportation coming in from further distances. Our jobs are here and everything, right? So it's not straightforward, right? So you're attaching a price to it, but it right, have you done it, right? Is it really fair? But still there is this greater thing, there is this argument that of the greater good, right? Yeah, so that's the idea behind utilitarianism. Yeah. So
Adi,
any
before we
point?
move, yeah,
Hmm.
before we move further, so I have 3 points regarding the Jeremy theory.
Hmm.
First of all, it just goes with the sum of the total individual values. So
Hmm.
if individual values are going like 51% and the other case is 49%, so that doesn't make any sense for the people just like 1% above the 50%, and they win the entire case. And the
Correct.
second thing is regarding the WIs, like, do they have any weights against individual? Like
Hmm.
some persons, not all the persons may be equal.
Hmm.
So just like machine learning, we have a weights assigned to each edges. I think like I'm not sure whether he has considered it, but WIs or weights might be considered.
Hmm.
And third thing is like it may be possible that maybe a white people or black people, maybe a Dalits in UP and all. So a bigger community may suppress a few people who are not well or who may be caste-wise backward. So it could harm those people, even though it is good for maybe the bigger, richer classes. So
Correct.
these are the 3 points.
Yeah, no, excellent. Yeah, no, these are all very, very important, right? So you're seeing that, right? So again, the point is that if you just apply the theory arbitrarily, then you have all of these different kinds of issues, right? So like 51 versus 49, right? It just doesn't make sense. But anyway, that's still what we follow in our country for democracy or for like shareholding, so many things. Yeah, but yeah, so that is one example, right? That it runs into issues which don't make sense, right? So if you just reason from just using this theory, then you end up with these situations where the theory just leads to weird results. Yeah, and same right with attaching weights, right? So or the issue with majoritarianism, in the sense that there's a lot of people who favor something, a few people who would be harmed, but just because they are small in number, their voice may not be heard, right? So again, democracy in some sense tries to correct for it, right? So democracy is all about consultation, that even though there might be a minority, but you still have to respect their views, their issues, and not just do it just because there is a majority, right? So this is exactly where they don't then apply the utilitarian kind of theory, right? Maybe they would attach a weight to the kind of harm or kind of issue that the minority community will face, right? So this weighting becomes important, but again, things become arbitrary if when you start thinking about, right, what are these weights that I am trying to attach, right? So just like we was looking at, right, figuring out the value of life, the way it's done statistically seems arbitrary. I mean, in developing countries like ours, where there is a lot of labor supply, jobs are few, right? So we don't have this kind of I mean, risk hardly might be figuring in people's job decisions, right? People who work in coal mines, for example, right, which are very risky occupations. Are they really paid much higher than if they were doing some safer jobs? Well, that's not the case, because in many situations they would not have an option, right? They would just have to take up whatever jobs are available in their area, right? These are some cases where in practice it can be arbitrary to attach a value to something or to put a weight to something. Yeah. So there are, so again, right, these theories cannot be just applied just by themselves, right? You need to think more about further checks and balances that can be put into place. Yeah. But yeah, excellent that these are exactly, each individual theory can lead to arbitrary things. But yeah, our point is that just exposing ourselves to this ethical theory style of reasoning is giving us valuable lenses to look at, right? Like Kant is emphasizing on universality, on rationality of people, of treating them as equals. Here we're talking about the need to map different stakeholders, similar to universalism. We're thinking we've brought in a notion of greater good versus individual justice, right? So that's the takeaway in some sense from this. A variation on this is rule utilitarianism, where just like utilitarianism, we were talking about should I take an action or not, and you were then doing this utility based calculus. Here it's on rules, that should this rule be adopted or not. And then you follow the same thing, the same principle, that if I adopt this rule, or if society adopts this rule, then are we better off or not? Yeah. Essentially just applies the same principle but to rules instead of specific actions. Yeah. And again, the same kinds of things arise, that you have some underlying reasoning. It avoids the problem of moral luck, that you can argue that, well, I should not be driving through traffic lights. As an action, maybe in retrospect, I got lucky, but actually, as a rule, it's not something that we should adopt, because, right, well, overall good, if everybody adopts this rule, would not be positive, right? Same kinds of things that we've been talking about, that how do we, right, reduce everything to a single metric, single dimension, which where we can talk about it, right? So the value of life that we were talking about, it ignores the problem of unjust distribution of consequences, right, and that requires the principle of justice, right? So this leads to these conflicts also, that okay, something might be good overall for society, but then it can be unjust to individuals, then what do we do? Yeah. So of course, this theory doesn't resolve any of that, and neither does any other theory by itself. So ultimately, you need combinations of many of these things working in parallel, and which is what actually happens in practice, right? And we'll get into like practice of law in a bit. Yeah. The next is another, right, theory by, right, which was ultimately built up more strongly by John Rawls, right, of social contract. So social contract is basically saying that, well, we live in a society and therefore we have implicitly agreed to live by certain rules, right? So the question then becomes that what are these rules ultimately that we are thinking we will follow, right? That these rules govern the relationship and nobody is above these rules, right? So that morality consists of a set of rules governing how people are to treat one another, that rational people will agree to accept for their mutual benefit, on the condition that others follow those rules as well, right? So this is now giving a more nuanced interpretation or nuanced application to bringing both Kant universalization of rules as well as utility theory to utilitarianism to some extent, right? So you're saying that it's not just about universalizing rules, but rules that rational people will expect everybody else to follow. Yeah, that rational people will then accept that, okay, we are accepting these rules through which we will live by. And why are they doing it? They are doing it with the idea that there will be overall social welfare if everybody were to follow these rules, right? So you have rationality coming in over here, that people will accept these rules, as well as you have the greater good coming in over here. So the question is that how can people agree on what rules should be included in a social contract, right? So that's what John Rawls started with asking. So Rawls is considered one of the greatest philosophers in the 20th century, right? So he wrote this very famous book called Justice as Fairness, and which we see has come in, played a big role also in the whole fairness in AI and machine learning literature. So we'll get to that after some classes. So here basically Rawls says that how should this social contract be achieved? So he brought in a very important concept called the veil of ignorance. That you should think about these rules when you're operating from behind a veil, that you are ignorant of where are you situated in society, right? What place will you hold in society in terms of your wealth or gender, physical abilities, anything, right? If you don't know what position you will have in society, would you impose a particular rule or not, right? So that's the main point, that when you're not aware of whether right, irrespective of where you were, whether you would benefit from that rule or not, then those are that's how you should think about these rules, because otherwise you will always get greedy. You might end up making rules which favor you over other people, right? So the veil of ignorance is basically about saying that you drop the knowledge of who you are in society, and only then, right? So it's a way of thinking about universality, right? That what if, right, everybody were to follow this same rule. Yeah. So he said that, well, when rational people are put behind a veil of ignorance, they will agree upon these principles. So these are again very important principles, right? Their roles as principles of justice, right? So this says that each person may claim a number of basic rights and liberties like freedom of thought and speech, freedom of association, right to be safe from harm, right to own property, as long as these claims are consistent with everyone else having a claim to the same rights and liberties. So it says that there should be a common set of basic rights and liberties which everybody should have access to. Yeah. And it then says that the idea is that if everybody has access to these rights and liberties, it means that if everybody has right to education, if everybody has a right to health, right, then they will be able to achieve their abilities. They will be able to achieve what they the right, whatever they're able to get to. There's equal opportunity to grow, right? And then it says that even then certain inequalities might arise, right? But those should arise only after everyone has had a fair and equal opportunity to achieve. So therefore you might be earning more than other people, but only because your natural talents are better than others, right? So just because you're a gifted cricketer, you're a gifted swimmer, or you're very intelligent, then you will end up in a higher position in society, and you will be better off than others. But this is something you have achieved as a result of your own natural talents, or as a result of your own greater hard work, right? It's not that others could not achieve it, right? They had equal opportunity, which are these. Everybody had access to those basic rights and liberties, right? So the idea is that you put everybody, give them the same initial conditions, and then after that people will achieve whatever they can, but not because others had a lack of opportunity. They would achieve it only as a result of their own hard work or their own natural talents. Yeah. And he also added a second principle, that these inequalities should, however, be in such a way that they also end up benefiting the least advantaged members of society. So this is Rawls' very famous difference principle, right? So this is where he brought in the whole concept of social welfare or the greater good also over here. Yeah, that they should benefit others, but even over here he brought in a principle of justice, that they should benefit the least advantaged members of society, right? So in the sense that you might have a lot of wealth, right? And you might have achieved it through hard work, right? All good, right? But you should still use this wealth in a way that it benefits the least advantaged person in society, right? So you should still see how you can put this wealth in the service of others who are disadvantaged. And because, right, so now you, if you're operating in this world, right, why are these people disadvantaged? They're probably disadvantaged because maybe they did not have enough of natural talent to rise up, right? Or maybe the initial conditions of everybody having access to the same rights and liberties, maybe that failed in the case of some people, right? So, right, and this is also what we see so much in the world around us, right? That we know that, like in India, there is a right to education, but we also know that public schools are not as good as private schools, right? We know so many issues that poor people have in sending children to school. And even the pandemic has created so much of inequality with them not having access to devices and all of that, right? So the point is that in the real world, it's very difficult to achieve a situation where everybody has access to these liberties. So this principle does get violated for many people, and it increases therefore the imperative that inequalities that do arise, it's not arising only because of hard work and natural talent. They're also arising because of not everybody having access to the same rights and liberties, and therefore it brings in this further principle that these inequalities which arise, they should be put in the service of helping the least advantaged members of society, right? And right, so you're seeing that there are many things which Rawls was able to bring together, right? he was able to bring together some notion of justice, that it should benefit least advantaged members and everybody should have access to certain basic rights. Right? The veil of ignorance is what he uses as a starting point, which talks about rationality, that only rational people would agree to these, living by this kind of a code of conduct or this social contract. It also brings in concept of overall social welfare by thinking about that ultimately people are trying to achieve their best and leading to overall social welfare. Yeah. So this Rawls is actually credited, right? So the book Justice as Fairness came out around 1970, I think, and it's considered as one of the best and I mean most comprehensive way of thinking about justice, about thinking about ethics. Right. So basically, the first principle is saying that everybody should have access to the same rights and liberties, right? So you don't want that some people have greater access to something, and that will be an unjust situation. So therefore, you want to solve for that, right? So therefore, you should make sure that whatever you're doing, it's not making the world more unjust. So this is sort of what we were looking at when we were examining the consequences of existing social systems. That existing social systems tend to entrench existing inequalities even further. Yeah, that people who are better off will be able to make easier use of technology. Yeah, right. So that's why the digital divide, that not everybody has equal access to the internet. That is a problem that we need to solve, right? So you can see that it brings that part in, right? Similarly, right, we were talking about market structures which try to create monopolies, right? And that monopoly means that now somebody is more powerful than others, right? And therefore they might have access to they might have easier access to other things, right? And this is where regulations become important so that they can restore more equality, right? So this is the first principle, that everybody, you should aim for a world through by bringing in technologies and everything, so that people have more and more and equal access to the same rights and liberties, right? It shouldn't be that technology can favor somebody more than others. Yeah. And then the difference principle is that ultimately whatever inequalities do arise, they should be in the service of those who are most disadvantaged. Yeah. So this is an example of what's known as progressive taxation, right? That should you have a tax plan that everybody has to pay the same amount of tax, right? Versus what we actually have in practice is a progressive taxation, right? That people who with higher income have to pay a higher tax. Yeah. So there are tax brackets which are done for this purpose, right? So the whole point over here is that whatever inequality has arisen in society, you're taxing people who are richer to a greater extent, and all of this taxation is being put in the benefit of the least disadvantaged, to create, let's say, social welfare policies, so that the world access to education, access to health is more equal. Yeah. Which the first principle of justice talks about. Yeah. Right. So Rawls basically brought many of these things together in brought it into a framework of reasoning. Yeah, which is considered to be really like a breakthrough in philosophy of justice. Yeah, right. So there are some examples that there's a chain of DVD stores, and the stores therefore collect information about customer profile, about what customers want, right? So this is what we see so much in the privacy issues, right? That does the customer have, that what should be the social contract, right? What rules should society follow? And different, depending on what rules it follows, it leads to different results, right? So that's the main point, that should, if there is a rule in society that that customers have the right to expect their name, address will be kept confidential, right? So if customers have the right to expect that names and address of transaction will be kept confidential, and it will be divulged only after the permission is taken, then it is wrong for the DVD owner to sell this information without having asked for permission or consent, right? So therefore, if the social contract you've agreed to is that the customers have a right to expect that these names be kept confidential, then in that situation it is wrong to divulge information, right? If, however, you're operating with a social contract that this information of the transaction, right, that person X rented this DVD from the owner, right? So it's a transaction which was performed between two parties, and both, in some sense, are owners of information about the transaction. And therefore, because the DVD owner also owns this information about the transaction, therefore they can share it with whoever they want. Yeah, because it's not just that you or the customer has access to this information. So if that is the social contract that people have agreed upon, that it's information about a transaction, and transaction is two parties, and both parties have ownership over this information of the transaction, and therefore they can divulge it to whoever, right? So then there is nothing wrong in selling this information, right? So the point is that it depends on what social contract is agreed upon by people. Yeah. So that's what the whole social contract thing means, right? So this also, Rawls theory also gives us many of these pointers, right? It's framed in a language of rights, that there are certain liberties which everybody has a right to, right? And it also explains why people cooperate for common good and not always act in self-interest, because right, because it comes from the veil of ignorance that only rational people would then end up adopting this particular setup. Right? It can also explain why civil disobedience can be the morally right action, because now the question is that this set of liberties which was adopted, right? People adopted a set of liberties, but maybe it's not complete, right? The world changes, people's perceptions of what is right changes, and this is what civil disobedience is all about, right? That you want to change the law, right? You want some new liberties to be added, right? So right to education came in very recently, right to information came in very recently, right? So these rights and liberties are, so law is constantly evolving, and the way law evolves is that you encounter new situations and you then want to change this notion, right? So the kind of liberties or rights which are considered today may not be the same as tomorrow, right? Tomorrow you might want to include something else, you might want to remove something, depending on how the world evolves. And because computers are also coming in and they're creating all these new situations, so now we will also have data protection laws very soon, right? Many countries already have them, right? So like Kant and everybody, right, over there was no way out if a particular rule was violated. Over here, it's a theory which can accommodate evolution, right? That as things change, you can change the set of liberties that you consider starting with. Yeah. So this is why it's considered as a workable ethical theory. Yeah. Right. So case against is, well, no one signed a contract, a social contract as such, right? These are what reasonable people would agree to, right? And the way, therefore, any of these theories are implemented in practice is by the rule of law, by code of law, right? That law is being framed by using many of these arguments, right? By using Kant's argument or utilitarian arguments or Rawls arguments. So law is emerging from many of these different, bringing many of these different ideas together, right? But of course, in itself, right, if you were to just follow Rawls theory in itself, then the argument you would raise against it is that this is fine, right? All this is wonderful, but why should I do it, right? No, well, I have not signed any social contract. Why should I even say that I want to do this because I want to live in a society? Yeah, right. So again, and there are conflicts and so on which come up. It may also unjustly treat people who cannot uphold a social contract, right? It requires to distinguish between people who deliberately break moral rules and people who cannot understand a rule, right? Or who may have some limitations in following a rule, right? But still, the point is that it's it brings in a very important framework, right? Where you want to talk about individual justice, you have the language of rights coming in over here. You have a notion of thinking about who are the stakeholders in this whole process that you have considered. Yeah. What we're going to talk about is virtue ethics, right? Right. So essentially, right. So that's the summary, right? Kantianism talks about, right, respecting everybody, treating them as equals, as rational beings. Utilitarian talks about you should think about the consequences and you should enumerate stakeholders and think about whether it's right or wrong and so on, right? Social contract theory talks about equal access to liberties, which rational people, right? So the whole point of Rawls's theory is that if you put on this veil of ignorance, which means that you don't know what is your position in society, then and if everybody thinks like that, then what are the principles they will agree to? So he says that the principles they will agree to, and that's the whole argument in his book, that people should have access to certain liberties and rights, and as long as any of these inequalities that still do result are not because of lack of access to rights and liberties, right? So that's what he talks about, right? And these are some principles which basically come out, right? So from Kant, and social contract, right? We realize the importance of autonomy, right? People should be free to choose what they want, right? So this is about, right, treating them as rational beings, that they can make their own choices, right? Similarly, dignity, that people are valued for themselves, right? We're not treating them as instruments for our own gain, right? Again, coming from Kant, right? Then we talk about rights, that there are certain rights that everybody should have for these liberties, coming from Rawls, right? Duties that everybody is obligated to follow, which again, right? So that's the social contract that people agree to. Notions of justice and fairness, that how are ultimately resources distributed. Transparency again comes from rationality, that you want people to be informed, and then notions of universality, right? So these are all great rules, right, that we should keep in mind, that are any of these rules being violated when we think about technology and so on, right? Then consequentialist utilitarian theories tell us also to about the reason to enumerate all stakeholders and to think about long-term and unintended effects as well. Yeah. So now you can, of course, the whole point also that we've seen is that none of these theories are sufficient in themselves, right? There are all these weird corner cases, dilemmas that come up, right? And anyway, this is also not how we live our life in general, right? So ultimately the theory, so these are normative theories in the sense that they're starting with they're laying down their own axioms, right? But ultimately a theory should have some way of connecting with reality, right? Only then the theory will gain acceptance, right? So this is also not commonly how we live our life, right? We don't commonly, right, live our life by Kant's rules or consequentialism, right? It's actually a mix of many of these principles and various rules that we are seeing, right? So this is where virtue ethics comes in, right? That actually people behave in a different way. It's not that we always live by rules, right? Rules of that we have to make sure everybody has certain rights or that we have certain duties, right? But rather, what virtue ethics says is that people normally, and this comes from Aristotle, right? That people want to be virtuous. So it's a slightly recursive definition over here, right? That what does it mean to be virtuous? So I think I'll come back, right? The best way in which you think about this, right? The best way in which people, right, we tend to think about this, that when we're deciding, right, that we try to think that will we be proud of this work? Or if we think back, will it make us feel bad that we did something, right? Or will this lead to any bad habits, right? If we start doing something, will it be like a slippery slope, right? That we might get habituated to certain relaxations. It could be a slippery slope, one thing could lead to another. Or are we setting the right example for others, right? What would somebody whom we respect a lot, what would they have done in this situation? Yeah. So Aristotle and the whole theory of virtue ethics, it sort of revolves around it's a very relative definition, in the sense that everybody will have a different yardstick or different guidelines that they would follow, but it is coming from a place where you're essentially reflecting on your own actions and you're trying to compare, right? You want to take certain actions which people you respect, right, what are called moral exemplars, what they would have done, or you want to set the right examples, maybe children, right? That is this what we want to teach our children, for example, right? Will we be proud of this work, right? So this is how it looks at it. Right action is an action that a virtuous person acting in character would do in the same circumstances, right? And a virtuous person is a person who possesses and lives out the virtues. Virtues are those character traits that human beings need in order to flourish and be truly happy, right? So this is the key assumption over here behind this theory, that human beings, we are able to evaluate, right? What is it that makes us truly happy? What is it that we need to live our lives? And this is something, right? So the key point, another key point that the theory talks about is that this evolves, right? So it's not that we are born with some of these traits like honesty, courage, compassion, and so on, right? Rather, these evolve, right? So they develop through learning and practice. A person can improve their character by practicing self-discipline, while a good character can be corrupted by repeated self-indulgence, right? And these character traits are developed by the communities to which we belong, by our families, religious institutions, what we learn in school, private public associations, right? And as people grow and mature, their character is affected by the values that the communities prize, by role models, right? Moral exemplars, or role models that we read about in books, in stories, right? Movies. So the underlying assumption over here is that we are learning in the process, right? And over time we have the capability to become more and more virtuous, if, and this is anyway what happens naturally, right? That through our society, through the wider community, family, everything, right? And what we see, what we watch, culture, all of that shapes what is it that we value more, right? Right? So essentially, what Aristotle says, right? So there are intellectual virtues that people gain through the ability to reason, and things like science, which you learn, which are more factual. But there's also moral virtues, right? Which are virtues of character, which are formed by habit, disposition, repetition of different virtuous actions, right? So essentially, the point is that the theory says that we don't necessarily live our life by certain rules, right, which Kant and others have come up with. Rather, we evolve, right? We develop some of these, and it may not even be a rule, right? Rather, it is a habit that we develop, right? And in that case, whenever we are faced with some dilemma, whenever we are faced with some questions, right, we will think about it. We might make a decision, right? And but we still might have doubts about it. So it's also what they call a disposition to feel in a particular way, right? That it will also bother us if we've made a decision, but still we have some doubts. It will keep bothering us, right? So essentially, it's about nurturing some of this, right? That you keep learning in the process. You learn from society and everybody, but you're always self-reflective, and you're always trying to evaluate your actions based on whether would you like others to do it, whether would you be proud of being remembered for these things, right? Right. So that's basically virtue ethics in a nutshell, right? Now the good thing with virtue ethics is that although it's more of a relative theory, because everybody can have different yardsticks, but it acknowledges that nobody is perfect and people evolve and grow. So that is good, that even if somebody has made mistakes, you're also seeing, right, they're repeating the same mistakes again and again, right? So it gives you a certain handle on evaluation also. Then they virtuous people, so I mean that's the whole point. And it's all ultimately with reason, right? That you want to encourage people to reason and to think about their actions, right? So it's not that you're just doing something just because, right? Like some of the other relativist theories that we saw, like divine control and so on. You're not doing something just because somebody told you to, or right, but you're reasoning for yourself. Yeah, it's of course, right. It's a very individual conception, so therefore it becomes hard to use it for like lawmaking and so on. But still, you can use at least certain principles, right? That are people improving over time, or are they repeating certain issues? So that is why Quinn says that this is another example of a workable theory, right? Now, why are we thinking about all this, right? So if you go back to some of the examples that we saw, that, right, so you're trying to evaluate, let's say, the decisions the machine is making. Yeah, right. One way is that you code some rules into the machine, right? You code rules of Khan, or you code Rawls's social contract into the machine, and the machine is trying to follow those rules, right? Another way of looking at it is like a learning machine, which is learning to become more and more virtuous over time. Yeah. So it's a different way of, right, when you apply these theories into computer ethics, into thinking about computers, right, then they would lead to different ways of implementing them, right. The rule based theories would be about putting in rules into the machine that the machine has to follow. Virtue ethics would say that the machine should somehow, right, you should computationalize certain processes so that the machine is able to evaluate whether what it did, right, whether other people would also have acted similarly. Maybe there are some consensus mechanisms built into it that decisions taken by the machine are evaluated by humans, for example. And through that process, the machine is learning to become more and more virtuous. That what are these values that I should try and imbibe in my decision making? Yeah. So that's one way in which we'll see some of these theories can get applied. Yeah. So that's the idea, right? This also, right, you can take a look, right, at what makes an action morally right. So act, if you go by utilitarianism, that is it increasing the total good of all the stakeholders, right? Or virtue theory will say it is consistent with the actions that a virtuous person will take. Right? Or you say it is in accordance with the moral rule, and what makes the rule correct? So Kant's categorical imperative is that imagine everyone following this rule, right? And in that case, also would this rule be adopted? So if so, then that's a good rule to have, right? Utilitarianism again, right? At the level of rules, it's saying that, right? If this rule were to come in, then would it lead to greater common good, right? And social contract theory is saying that these are rules which are they ensuring equal distribution of liberties among everybody, right? Is it leading to any inequality or violations through that process, right? So that's how each of these theories looks at these different rules. Yeah. Right. Now, these are some examples, right? Right, that some examples from applying these ethical theories, right? So we saw this example, right, of robot and Frank, right, where the robot actually started stealing just to keep Frank more healthy, mentally active, and so on, right? Right. So how do these theories, what do these theories inform us, right? So Kantianism would say that the robot was solely guided by his duty to Frank, but which superseded other rules like telling the truth or avoid stealing. Right, now these are some rules as society which Kant, the categorical imperatives would say should not be sacrificed. Right, so you should, if you believe in rationality of others, you should speak the truth. You should avoid stealing because you wouldn't want, if this rule were universalized, you wouldn't want others to steal from you. So, right, so Kant's theory would argue that this was incorrect, right? So you shouldn't have been stealing, right? What you did was wrong, right? Similarly, we talked a little bit about that if we have to computationalize virtue ethics, that can the robot learn on its own about what is virtuous, right? Can he learn to become more virtuous, right? So it leads to the question that why do humans learn to become more virtuous over time, right? So typically, I mean, one way of thinking about it is that we are hardwired, right? We are hardwired to think about our own as well as the welfare of others, and therefore, and that is what drives us to think about role models, to think about, right, being proud of our work, to think about what our children would think about us, right? And that is why we have a sense of self and responsibility towards it, right? But can machines be made to think in this way, right? Because the robot is unconcerned about his own destruction, right? It's just a machine, right? So the robot would happily destruct itself for some, right? If its actions is leading to something, right? Then why attempt to be more virtuous? The robot wouldn't care about it, right? So it's sort of an argument saying that you can't really teach machines virtue ethics because machines wouldn't, really want to do this. So these are some views that you can think about. Right. Another example is a very nice paper called Design and Justice. So they use Rawls's theory that if you're a designer, right, designing technology, then what does Rawls's theory tell you? Right. So ultimately, as a designer, you're in a more powerful position than the user because you're more aware of the technology. You know what you're designing, and therefore you know a lot more than any other user, right? So if you were to think through, right, that here, because you're in a more powerful position, you have a greater access to liberties, or so in this case, you should think from the shoes of unspecified users and try to design so that it is users who ultimately would benefit and not you, right? So it's also saying things like keeping users more aware, avoiding invisibility of technology so that users can benefit from this, right? And so essentially the inequality that is there should be put to the benefit of those who are less powerful, right? Like other users in this process. Yeah. Right. So this is what leads to, so as we go along, we look at methods like participatory design methods like participatory design where users get to participate in the whole process. So these set of principles say that you should somehow build design methods so that users can also be included in the design process, or you should design so that there is more liberty and equality. Users can also have control over the technology, and right, you should design for minority groups. So all of that comes through these kinds of principles. Right? Veil of ignorance requires designers to imagine all possible users, but right, so it's right. So disadvantage also is that it's not always feasible to do that, right? But yeah, I mean it's a good application of thinking through that how these theories are actually being can be applied, right? So the point is again that all these theories are given a certain lenses, certain tools to look at, right, which we've often talked about. So these are right. So go through this in detail, and then this is another very easy paper to read through, right? That what are the questions, therefore, that if you're designing a technology, what are the questions that we should ask ourselves, right? Deontological theories like Kant's and Rawls, right, which talk about rules that we should follow, right? That what rights of others and duties to others must we respect in this context. How might dignity and autonomy of each stakeholder be impacted by this project? Right. So these are a set of questions to think about, right? Trust, justice, transparency, whether it will be universally acceptable, what conflicts come into the picture, right? So these are the questions that these theories prompt us to ask when we try to apply them to a particular system, right? Similarly, consequentialism says that who are these stakeholders who will be affected, right? What are we counting as well-being, or what negatives are we counting in the process? Is it too narrow, right? Or have we thought about all types of harms and benefits? How might future generations be impacted by this project, right? More significant harms, what is the common good, right? What are these trade-offs? Have we thought about these trade-offs? Similarly, virtue ethics, right? That are they the habits of other designers that we've seen, right? So we've seen how many people have designed technologies, but are we following in their footsteps, right? Would we want others to follow? If we take certain actions, would we want others to follow that? Would we be proud of our actions? Will this create any vicious habits or traits in users? Right, like any psychological impact of these technologies on the users. So these are basically a set of questions which these theories put up to us. Right. So go through some of this. Similarly, there are a lot of toolkits which people have put up. Right. So there's an ethic for designers toolkit, which basically says that whenever you're thinking of something, you should think about why do you, as a person, why do you want to do this in the first place, right? So it's about your virtues, right? That why would you want to do it? And then in this process, right, what is it that you're doing? And in that, are you violating any rules? Right? So you think about rights, are you violating anybody's rights, dignity, and so on, right? So in terms of actual content of what you're doing, you need to think through that. And then also, what is the end state that you want this system to achieve? So that those you should evaluate through consequentialism, right? So these essentially give a similar set of, right? They list a similar set of values, and they, just like this other paper, these lead to certain questions that are the systems promoting some of these values, right? So what are your own intentions of doing it in the process? Which of these values are being honored or not? And ultimately, what is the end goal of all of this? Similarly, there's another one, right? So I think we talked about some of these things, that this is more of from a risk assessment framework, that what would happen if 100 million users were to start using this? What would be impacted if your product is successful? How would the environment be impacted? Right? So a lot of such questions that come up. Yeah. So that's the whole point in a nutshell, right? That all these different frameworks, they are giving us these ways of thinking through which we can come up with certain principles. They prompt us to ask certain questions from the technologies that we're putting out there, right? So that's how to think about it. Yeah. So and it's also important to look at a couple of other views. So there is the medical profession, right? And we've seen how, right, the way they deal with ethics is quite different, right? So they, just like computer science, we've come up with certain principles, right? They also have, they have a small set of 4 principles, right? Autonomy, that the patient should have the autonomy. Justice, right? Resources should be fairly distributed, right? Justice from, so it's similar to Rawls's fairness notion. No one group should sort of face an undue burden of disease or, let's say, testing of drugs, right? Beneficence, that it should be aimed for the good of the patient, and non-maleficence, that there should not be any harmful feelings, right? So you can again see, right, that the ethical theories that we've studied, right, you can think about, right, which ones have inspired what kind of these principles, right? But the point that is that medical ethics has evolved a very strong set of safeguards, that no new drugs or devices are released before they're tested. There are clearly defined lines of accountability and handling, certifications, training, right? One thing to think about is that many of these are missing in computer science, for example, right? That, so partly in medical ethics, the research, so you would hear about things like IRB approvals, that whenever, even if you have to conduct any research, you have to propose your method, the method has to be approved, you have to disclose what harms could arise, what risk could happen, and only then are you given an approval to conduct that research. So in the medical field, there are very strong safeguards at the research stage itself. And the industry only typically builds upon this research. The industry doesn't, you don't just release drugs just like that. Right? But in the computer science, so it's something to think about. We won't discuss it right now, but something that you should think about, that in computer science is very different, right? Neither do we need such approvals for research, nor do we need approvals, nor does industry need approvals before they release some products out, right? So the principles that computer science has come up with, therefore, like the ACM code of ethics, right? There's sort of quite, although we do talk about many of these principles as well, but it's not implemented in the same way. Yeah. So that's something to think about, right? Then now the other view is that, okay, now these are certain principles, but how should organizations adopt these principles? Right? So largely, I mean, we've not really defined who is the stakeholder who should be thinking about implementing or thinking through these ethical rules, asking these questions, right? It could be the technologist, the designer, or it could be the organization doing it in a rigorous manner to comply with certain regulations that have been imposed by the laws in the democracy. So at some point, some of these laws might be missing, and as society builds a clearer definition of right and wrong, then some of these laws could come into the picture, and gradually things will move in a more ethical direction. So, right, so there's this question that who ultimately is the entity, right? The people or the companies, or, right, who are supposed to follow some of this, right? So that's what Rogerson talks about a little bit. So Floridi, another person whose name we'll hear quite a lot, Luciano Floridi. So he talks about artificial intelligence, right? And right, that what principles should we follow for that? So if you actually think about it, right, then medical ethics is very focused on the patient, that we want to protect the patient. We want to make sure that there is no harm that comes on the patient. Right? Floridi, similarly, over here, he's talking more from a standpoint of society in general, that artificial intelligence you should think about what is artificial intelligence replacing? How can the transition be made more equitable? Right? Is human agency being removed in the process? Is the technology ready enough to remove human agency? Right? What should we choose to delegate to artificial intelligence? Right? So all of these questions are coming from a point of view that human society or humanity should not become subservient to technology, right? And that sort of inspires some of the principles. So he also actually comes up with beneficence and non-maleficence and so on, but all of these principles are more from an impact on human society itself, as opposed to an impact on specific on the patient, which medical ethics talks more about. Yeah. So go through this, right? So he talks about, right, therefore importance of legal systems, that whatever problems might arise, right, so legal systems should be in place to do that. Participatory mechanisms to ensure alignment with societal values and public opinion, right? Because only then people will accept technology, right? Only if it agrees with public opinion. So those mechanisms are important. Talks about explainability, auditing of technology, that grievance redressal should be available. There should also be more AI literacy, because only then people, if there is too much of invisibility, then people won't even know that, okay, there is some technology operating over here. So that AI literacy is very important. After the technology has been released, you still need to monitor it, right? Cross-disciplinary consensus. That you should have pilots. You should run it in sandbox environments, understand the impact, and then scale. There should be self-regulation, because legal regulations may not always be advanced enough. It takes longer, right, for society to understand the impact, and then for regulations to come into the picture. Right. So all of this is sort of another view to think broadly in terms of technology's impact on humanity, or the sense of what is human, and those views are important. Right. Then Floridi also is very well known for another theory that he came up with called information ethics. And information ethics basically says that information itself should be the entity that we want to protect, because he says that we are all information beings. And it's very interesting, right? So he says that the Copernican revolution, right? So when Copernicus actually discovered that the earth is not the center, the earth is only going around the sun. So that sort of showed humans that we're not that special, right? We're just going around the sun. It's not that we are the center of the universe, right? Then when Darwin came up with the theory of natural evolution and showed that we actually evolved from animals, then that sort of even displays humanity even more from the center, that we are not that special, right? We're just like any other animal, right? And then Sigmund Freud, who came up with all these theories that our actions are shaped by repressed feelings, repressions of rage, of sex, and so on. So this again was like a dampener, that humans are not that superior, right? So many of our actions are just driven by, are like defense mechanisms. They're driven by these different repressed processes. And then the information age, which people say we are in now, right? So this is sort of showing that we are actually just informational objects. We take in information through our senses, and it shapes our thoughts. So this is what we've seen being reinforced again and again by mass media, by social media, that our beliefs get influenced by what we see. So again, right? So what is so special about us, that if we are ultimately just being shaped by information, right, that we're receiving. So this basically led to Floridi saying that we need to consider information itself as the entity that needs to be protected. So just like medical ethics talks about the humans, over here, right, in Floridi's AI for Good, he talks about humanity as a whole, right? So here he talks about information itself as the object that needs protection. And therefore, the rules that we are applying, we may not necessarily always think in terms of who is it harming, who is it benefiting, and so on. But we can also think that, is it impacting the information or the infosphere, as he calls it, right? Infosphere meaning that everything is represented in information. So anything that corrupts this information, like bad social media or bad content ranking algorithms, right? So those things are therefore should be avoided, right? Because they are spoiling the infosphere. Yeah. And this is also similar to what Norbert Weiner, right? So he also had this whole idea that humans also basically communicate with other humans and machines through just information. So he actually, at that point, he said that, well, it might be possible to just fax a person across, because if all that we are is information, and information can be represented in bits, then you can just fax a person across. Yeah. So anyway, but so go through this, right? So the main point over here with Floridi and Weiner and so on, right? So ultimately, it's about saying that, okay, there are all these theories of ethics. Now you can think about applying them for preservation of humans, for preservation of humanity, individuals, or humanity as a society, or thinking about information itself as the entity that needs to be protected. And right, so those can then give us, so we can then start thinking in terms of technologies and their impact on the infosphere, and how different theories say that this infosphere should be shaped or should be behaving. Yeah. Cool. So again, right? The bottom line is therefore that you think about this big picture, right? Because this will become relevant to reason for whichever entity that we might be wanting to reason for.